next and our last assignment in the CPC 101 class is a limited color master copy. And keep in mind, just because we have one assignment in this program that's a limited color master copy doesn't mean I want this to be your only colored master copy. In fact, once you leave this program and you're operating as an artist trying to learn and better yourself for the rest of your career, the best solution to figuring out problems is to look at masterworks and to execute master copies. Every time you do a master copy, if you're doing it correctly, like we've talked about, observing, layering the paint correctly, getting the same color choices as the artist, then you're going to be learning a little bit more about how an artist operated, how an artist worked, and sort of absorbing a little bit of their skill set. So you should be doing this frequently. In fact, whenever you're wanting to learn something new, and at very least once a year or so, it's a good idea to be working on a master copy and trying to better yourself, further yourself by learning what better artists or more skilled artists have done before you. So we're going to do one in class here. You'll have, I think, 4 sessions to do this, all a demo for some of that time. So you'll end up with something like 8 to 10 hours or so to execute this master copy. So again, we're working on the premise that you're probably going to be only working out a small portion of your master copy. It's unlikely you're going to get through an entire finish, and if you do, you're probably not doing something correctly in the amount of time we have. But I do encourage you to be executing one at home. In fact, that is your requirement for advancing to the 200 level of the CPC program, is that you actually finish a successful color master copy that looks as though it could presumably have been done by that artist. It's not an easy task. It's just not simply a matter of matching the right values and roughly the right colors. It's a matter of making it look like something they could have done, which is a whole different idea in and of itself. So we have an example here of a piece of a demonstration that I did in one of the classes here. And the focus was primarily just the torso, and the working method with this painting, this is a painting by Alma Tadema, is to build it up with layers. You build it up and you scrape it down a little, build it up, scrape it down a little, so that as you get towards the end, you start to see tiny subtle variations poking through layers. And so it takes on more of an effect of how flesh tone can look. So this process requires a layering process, and the process of scraping down and building up and then finishing with glazes and scumbles as needed. And that's identified by looking at the painting and seeing how the texture of paint is applied on the torso, and then seeing other areas to identify where we can locate pieces of underpainting showing through. So, starting with a somewhat monochromatic but a little bit colored block in, and then building on top of it with a color block in, scraping it down, and then building it up with scumbles, scraping it down until we arrive at something that's closer to a finish. This still isn't even really all the way to a finish. It's still not quite there. It's still a little rough. There's some areas where the strokes could be brought closer together. It probably requires an extra layer of paint. This was not quite the four sessions. So we're talking maybe 3 hours here, broken up over a couple weeks. When you guys are going to get 4 sessions and a couple hours in each session, so you should be able to advance it a little bit further. That is, of course, if you're not struggling with the drawing and the values at this point. And in our CPC 102 class, you've had many weeks talking about color, and we've done color charts, and we've talked about mixing of red, yellows, and blues, and how you should be able to achieve paint mixtures relatively easily. So at this point, you should be starting to get pretty comfortable with color. And so again, our focus here now is capturing the paint application. Now the type of artist that you choose, the paint application is going to be very different. So you need to make sure we stay on point with that. It has to be representative of what the artist would have done. So keep that in mind as we go. Other than that, we're working with a limited palette in this assignment. Your at-home project doesn't have to be limited. It can be a full palette range. But for this assignment, we really need to mitigate the possibility of your colors getting too crazy, and as a result, we're going to stick to that limited palette. Just one red, one yellow, and one blue, and then a white. Now, how should you choose which red, yellow, or blue to utilize? Well, I strongly encourage you to look at your master copy. You know, see what is the strongest yellow that you can identify, the most chromatic yellow, what's the most chromatic red, what's the most chromatic blue. Now, in this case, in this reference here, there's very little, if any, blue at all. It's very, very low chroma blues, and it can be identified, you know, peeking through some of the background areas there. And in some of the transition tones and a little bit of the shadows in some areas. And it's such a low chroma that black, ivory black, was enough to pull off the color in this copy. And you'll notice that, especially with older masterworks, that ivory black is an excellent choice for your blue because it's not too powerful. So if you identify blue in the model and you just are using ivory black to paint that blue, it's less likely that you're going to overshoot it out of the ballpark and make it look like a blue stripe down somebody's face. So ivory black can be a safe choice. If you're going to be doing a copy of, for example, a Joshua Reynolds or a painting of that era, that style where you're using a closed grisaille underpainting, you know, some of that ivory black closed grisaille underpainting shows through with the halftones to give just a bluish tint at the turning of the form from light to dark in the flesh tone without shooting it out of the ballpark. So ivory black is an appropriate choice for your blue. In the case of this alma-tadema, there's some red roses in there, so I went with a cadmium red. It's a pretty brilliant red in anticipation of getting to that area. The yellows weren't super, you know, sun yellow. They were a little bit more of a mellow yellow. So I went with a yellow ochre in that case. So my limited palette for this alma-tadema copy was ivory black, yellow ochre, cadmium red, and a titanium white. That's it. If you select the appropriate red, yellow, and blue, you shouldn't have any trouble matching, for the most part, colors that are believable to your master copy. If you have trouble with flesh tones, which I know a lot of artists do, and for a lot of you, that's why you're taking this program, because you want to be able to paint people and perhaps your flesh tones end up too chalky or washed out. Well, a good alternative if you can't seem to maintain the chroma in your flesh tones is to switch out the whites you're using from titanium white to a creminence or a lead white. Now, lead white does not have the strength that titanium does. So you can add more white into your mixtures and get some subtle value variations without getting your colors too washed out or chalky. You know, titanium is very strong, so you put a dab of that in your yellow-blue mixture or your yellow-red mixture, and all of a sudden your fleshy tone mixture is just blown out of the water. It's very pastelish looking. So we don't want any, you know, pastel yellow flesh tones. We want them to be rich and chromatic. So if you're having that issue, switching to a lead white can be advantageous. As far as, you know, I know some people have concerns because lead is in the name, but keep in mind, as long as you're not going to get it all over yourself, you know, rub it all over your skin, and as long as you're not going to eat any of it, then there should be no issue with toxic nature. You know, you're not going to get sick by inhaling lead white paint unless it's in powder form. So as long as it's natural paint, you're fine. And it's not much worse, if any, than in cadmium color, for example. So again, as long as you're not eating it, you'll be okay. If you are a messy painter, you should be wearing gloves regardless of whether or not you are utilizing lead white or not. So your first task is to identify the gamut, the range on the color wheel that represents the maximum red, maximum yellow, and maximum blue of your master copy. And then we're going to select the appropriate pigments to reach those ranges. From there, we'll get our painting set up. You need to decide if what type of block-in, if any, the artist used. Did they do a drawing first? Did they paint directly onto the canvas? You know, a lot of these old masters, especially the academic painters, would do drawings first, and that's totally acceptable. Don't feel like, because there's so many alla prima painters around here, that you have to jump right into working with paint. You can sort out the shape issues with a drawing, transfer it to the canvas, and then from there do an open grisaille block in or a closed grisaille block in, and then build on top of that. Or you could do a color block in and then build on top of that. But try to identify what the artist did. So many times I see students fail at this assignment because they don't want to draw it out. They just assume that the artist threw it on there without drawing anything and it came out correctly. If you need to figure out the drawing first, figure out the drawing first. And it's very likely that in most situations, the historical artist did the same. So that's totally fine. You work with whichever method you deem necessary to get the results.